sit on board of West Midlands Trains and also the board for Midland Connect. Thank you.
For that, Jackie. Any other declarations? Oh, Councillor Phil Bateman, welcome, Phil.
Yeah, Councillor Phil Bateman, Wolverhampton. Just for the first time, could I declare a non-pecuniary interest in relation to the Canal and River Trust, of which I sit on the West Midlands Advisory Board? And just for the first time, and hopefully for the very last time, just to say that I'm a former transport worker, and so I have a non-pecuniary interest in matters that relate to pensions with regard to the former Travel West Midlands.
Okay. As a proud owner of a narrowboat, Phil, I will no doubt be bending your ear at some point in time. Okay, colleagues. As you'll be aware, today is Mayor's Questions. We've been running these...
Chair, it's Steve Simpkins from Wolverhampton. I too will have to declare an interest on the Canal and River Trust for the Bradley Arm extension.
Fantastic. Great arm extension that is as well, Stephen. Okay. Thank you very much, colleagues. Okay. As we go through, if matters come up in questions that you feel the need to declare an interest, please do. Please also be assured that if your declarations of interest on your sort of council through your council business are up to date, you'll be covered on a number of general matters. Okay, so just for colleagues who are new to the proceedings and new to this meeting, we've been running a policy question time with the Mayor and a budget question time with the Mayor, I think now for probably 3 years.
Correct.
And I think they've actually been beneficial for both scrutiny and I would hope the executive function in giving us a chance to really sort of develop out some of the key challenges that the region faces. Clearly, the context of today's question time is probably very different to one that we may well have envisaged when we first set this agenda, not least that we may well, if it hadn't been for COVID, have had an election and we would be in a very different place potentially. I think, and you will understand that it's my view that we will need to spend quite a bit of time today on economic recovery and what COVID means for this region and the communities that we serve. And what I'm going to ask of colleagues on scrutiny, and welcome to my transport colleagues who've joined us, is that if we can very much have the sort of first 45 minutes to an hour looking at the economic recovery and what that means, we can then move on to pick up on broader specific things. Clearly, within economic recovery, strategically, transport is a critical factor, and that is very much where we would be seeing the transport questions today, whilst the more operational programme matters, I would expect you to cover off with Councillor Ward next week. So what we tend to do is we ask the Mayor to do a sort of overview and context. I then tend to come back and either agree or disagree, possibly usually disagree with a number of things the Mayor has said. I was talking with the leader of Birmingham last night, Andy, and what I did say to Ian was, at least I'm consistently challenging, whether it's the leader of Birmingham, whether it's the Mayor, I'm always there questioning. So if we hand over to Andy for him to have a short period, we will then start to work through a series of questions. I'm aware from colleagues' discussions in advance, there are concerns around government proposals around planning reform and what that means for the region, and clearly the real horror of the housing crisis in our region. I will to those colleagues once we've done the full economic recovery side. But Andy, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chair, and thank you everyone for coming together in these challenging times. So I've learned in these things it's best to be relatively brief in my introductory words because there's always so many questions, but I'll try to give some sort of framing to our thinking about this. So it seems ancient history now, but probably worth saying right at the beginning, when the crisis struck, the most important thing for the CA to do was to make sure we continued to provide the services that people needed where we were responsible. And obviously the best example of that was maintaining our transport services. And I am acutely aware that people who have no alternative other than using public transport for getting to work, that was absolutely mission critical. And I think actually across the West Midlands, a good job was done on that. And there were some nice little innovations like using our ring and ride capacity for actually providing key worker capacity. And of course, there was free travel as well for NHS workers. So that was the first action. And of course, similarly, if you look at our skills agenda, where we have more cash to spend than anywhere else through the education budget, we continued to pay all our providers through the worst days of the lockdown, even if they weren't providing our services, so they were there when we came out the other end. So the first point in the March, April, May point was maintaining the services that people really depend upon us for. The second point that I was very, very clear on, and I think the board was very clear on this, it wasn't just me, all of these decisions were collective, of course, was actually we can help stimulate recovery and protect jobs by getting capital spent, making projects happen. And actually, that's been some that we control ourselves, some where we're influencing government money, and some actually where we're leveraging in private sector money. And again, I think in a challenging situation where lots of the business cases have suddenly changed, a reasonable job has been done there as well. So the decisions have been taken through lockdown around University Station, for example, around further transport projects, around lots of brownfield regeneration projects, and it's been encouraging that those have continued. If we look at government funding, of course, the most significant decision taken during lockdown was the notice to proceed around HS2, and I think the region was effective in its lobbying there, could easily have been cancelled, and that would have meant job potential lost. And of course, if we look at leveraging in private sector cash, the best example of that would have been the Birmingham Life Sciences Park announced last week, where there was lots of lobbying done in the run up to that. And actually the fact cash was made available for the first part of that, the Precision Health Technologies Accelerator, actually is the thing that secured then the private sector piece. So a critical point about us not losing our nerve in terms of investment. The third question then was, how do we pivot given what's happened, though? We can't pretend the world goes on as normal, so there was critical pivoting. Now, that meant, first of all, a number of structural changes in terms of governance things that we set up. So you might want to quiz me on this. We had our economic intelligence group. We've had our recovery forum. We've had our community recovery group as well. So all of the structures were in place for us to try to decide how we move forward. But if I give you probably the best example of where this pivoting went, again, it's around the skills agenda, where we had to be really clear as to how we were now going to change some of how we spent our money and again, leveraged in public money. And a very good example of that, bringing us right up to date, is where we've been able now to launch our first youth hub, give our youth platform commitment. So again, thinking about how we can bring our services together in response to what is happening, because there is no question, and you'll draw on this many times, the single biggest issue is, of course, the likely increase in unemployment, and particularly how that disproportionately affects different communities. So we're trying to pivot our response there. And then the last thing I want to say is, whilst you deal with the immediacy, you also have to plan for the long term. And that's what, obviously, in the economic sphere, recharge document, you'll have seen this before, agreed collaboratively in June, cross-party, all the leaders on board, and critically, no other region has done anything like this as yet. So we're able to put that into government with a clear view, and we've got some success in drawing cash out of it already. Some elements, the cash has been given straight to us, like the Brownfield Fund. Some elements where government has put cash on the table to address what we were talking about. So Kickstart would be a good example of that. And some where, frankly, the lobbying has still got to go on, and I'm sure you'll want to question me on success there. And then bringing us right up to date, complementing the economic recharge document, we also now have our community recovery priorities, and that is work that's very much ongoing, and we will be taking that to the next board in November, and that reflects actually the priorities of what we called our citizens panel that influenced that through the summer. So I hope, Lisa, that gives you in relatively quick time just an overview of how we've tried to approach the role.
Okay. Okay. Thank you for that, Andy. And colleagues, if you want to be coming in with questions, if you can, raise your hands. I also positively welcome comments in the comment box, because again, as a chair, I can't read your faces so easily, but I can read comments, and it can steer me in terms of where your concerns might be. So I think, again, and we may well come back to things like who sits on the economic forum and who benefits in more depth. But I suppose where I come from, and it won't surprise you, where I consistently have come from as chair of this committee, and indeed this committee has as a whole, is who benefits and what does this, the so what does this mean for the communities we serve? And I think what I'm particularly keen to focus on is really the pandemic and the lived experience for the people within our region, because whatever economic growth we pursue, if it's not for the benefit of the communities we serve, then one has to question what the purpose is. And I suppose I had my bedtime reading last night of the State of the Region report, and a very stark line in there for me was that we have 496,000 people on furlough in this region, so approaching 500,000 people on furlough. That is equivalent to the total number of jobs in Birmingham as a whole. If we look at the patterns and where it is going in terms of redundancies across and experience elsewhere, we could well lose 30 to 40% of those jobs over the next few weeks. Whichever way we look at it, we will see a huge amount of pressure in terms of people losing their jobs. We've just this week alone, we've heard Marston Brewery, part of our hospitality supply chain in terms of beer, 2,100 people on furlough, those jobs are at risk. We celebrate the fact that the MAC gets a grant in terms of the creative industries. That doesn't help the 447 people who've already been made redundant by the MAC. We can equally celebrate what we're doing in terms of investment in transport and things like the Gigafactory, and Coventry putting a fantastic case together for that. Equally, though, when we overlay COVID, climate and automation technology, what we're starting to see is a collapse of our supply chain. So I was talking to a guy, 55, works in 16, rarely taken a day sick, has been in the automotive industries all his life, has been a trainer within that, and his company is folding because it's going to be an easier way through than actually trying to continue the transition. And it's the lack of bridge and transition that is one of the reasons for those people losing their jobs. So I suppose what I'm keen to try and understand, I was in the region working at the University of Birmingham in 2007-8. A lot of work was then done in terms of a jobs task force and a business task force. Similarly, I was around, and I'm not always around when there's a crisis and something going wrong, but I was around when Longbridge closed. And in all of those incidents, what we actually had was like a jobs task force on the spot, people rolling up their sleeves, providing bridge funding, providing revenue support, and actually providing on the spot skills, jobs, and that day transfer opportunities. And I think when I talk to colleagues across the region, including some of the leaders, they are concerned that we haven't got that kind of immediacy of response. So I suppose my first question, then I'll open it to colleagues, is, you know, why haven't we got some kind of jobs task force? Where is the immediacy of response? What can we be saying to the 500,000 people who are on furlough, facing potential unemployment and poverty in the months ahead? What is your response, and what is your ask of government?
Okay, so it's a big number, the 496. No one's denying that, and that's incredibly concerning. No question about that. And some, whatever is done, as the Chancellor said, we will not be able to protect all jobs. So let's just come to what we do for those who do lose their job. Then we'll come to what we can do to protect the sectors that you've talked about. One of the most critical things we are doing is looking at the resources we have for retraining people quickly. And that is why the various government schemes, such as Kickstart, is really critical. We in the CA will be the sort of coordinator of that for the West Midlands. And actually it launches next week. And there are already 3,000 applications for roles in the West Midlands for Kickstart, which is very encouraging before it's even launched. Then there are other schemes like the Digital Boot Camp, the extra money that we've used for from the adult education budget for extending training in our colleges. So there is, of course, the apprenticeship subsidy as well. And you'll be interested that our apprenticeship numbers are far, far more robust than national average numbers as well. So we're doing relatively well there. And please, there can be a whole load of questioning on our approach to that. But one of the critical things is we have all those retraining opportunities there for some who will. And this always happens in an economic crisis. Some have to refocus to new jobs. If we then come to the sectors individually that you've mentioned, let's go through each of them. Hospitality mentioned first of all, and Marston's, and my ask of government you asked there, that's very, very topical, Chair, because just this week we have been saying there has to be the same sort of support as exists if you go into tier 3 of restrictions for those areas like the majority of ours, which are in tier 2. So that means some extension of the job support scheme specifically for the sectors that cannot trade. That's a live conversation with government right now. We're also asking them, to answer your question specifically, about continuing to use the discretionary grants, where, of course, they said you couldn't spend the underspend. We're looking to do that. On culture, I think the sums that are coming forward from the Cultural Recovery Fund are valuable, actually. And so you've mentioned the MAC, but there are a number of local institutions, the Belgrade, the Albany, the Wolverhampton Grand still waiting. So a number of big supports there. And one thing to call out where we have not been successful with government, because we should acknowledge this, is we've also been calling consistently for more support to the self-employed in that sector, freelancers, and thus far our ask has fallen on deaf ears. Now on automotive, coming to exactly what you are talking about, there's 2 key points here. First of all, we need to protect that industry going forward. We've got to engage in the future of technology. So lots is being done there to, as you mentioned, the Gigafactory, we've got to win that. But far more importantly, there are things along the way that help in the electrification of that industry. And there've been lots of successful West Midlands businesses winning that. And it's not all doom and gloom. We've seen in the last 6 months, Lotus locate their business, all their R&D here, new jobs in Coventry, LEVC expanding, TBS bringing their motorcycle business here, all around this electrification of the future. So good news stories. But specifically what we're asking for at the moment is a programme that's in our recharge document that we call Project Great. And that is about taking the skilled people who will fall out of that industry potentially, putting them into a support operation with the Warwick Manufacturing Group so they can then work with SMEs to use their great skill, and it sort of protects them until they can return. So we have a live ask of government there, and I'm optimistic that that will find support as well. So hopefully I've covered all the areas that you mentioned in that response.
Okay, Mr. Mayor, before I bring my colleagues in, I suppose for me, it's those two specific points. In 2 weeks' time, the Fellows Scheme, as we know, it's coming to an end. People will be put on the jobs that the Chancellor deems that are viable. And, you know, I find this can't protect all jobs. I think I can remember sort of past Tory Chancellors talking about if it's not hurting, it's not working, and that, you know, the jobs are worth forsaking. And that seems to almost be the line we're getting this time around. So what I'm trying to get my head around, and I'm always very practical on this, is we have a cliff edge in 2 weeks. What have you got on the table, absolutely, in terms of money and support to help the jobs at risk at this point in time? And why are you not putting in place and learning from Longbridge closures 2007, where we put in place a jobs task force and things like bridging loans, really activated and did the knitting to bridge a terrible crisis?
We've got in place all the national provision, and you must ask the government about that, not me. But my own view is that they have actually acted strongly during the crisis to protect jobs. And what we have also got in place is all of the retraining that I've already told you about very clearly. And what we've also got in place is all of the advice through the growth hubs, all of the business support structures that are there to help businesses deal with the transitions that is occurring. And, you know, it's a relatively small amount of sum, but if you look at the brilliant work done by the Greater Birmingham LEP, they've got this whole business scheme around pivoting. So how do businesses think about slightly different futures to their past? So there are different support schemes all there.
Okay, I think we will come back to this, because what I'm after, and I'm quite happy to give you time to find it, is I'm after specifics. You know, we talk about the youth hub, how much money, how many people. You talk about Kickstart. If there's 3,000 people who've applied when we haven't even started,
yes,
you know, that just goes to show the amount of need. We talk about millions with giga hubs. We talk about millions with life science parks. That is not the lived experience of people in our city and region at this point in time. And what I'm after is the absolute experience. What I'd like to do is to bring in some colleagues now, and then we can they may well have specifics in terms of their areas that can evidence this more. Kathy, if I could come to you first. Kathy?
Yeah, sorry, Chair. I was having a problem with me buttons. Right. Thanks for that, Chair. So I've got a couple of questions, if that's okay. And I do like to see things in fairly straightforward and simple terms. So how many jobs have been lost in this region since COVID? How many jobs have we lost to date? And then, because I think that for me helps set the scene to understand what the job losses are and what the creations are, and whether there's a mismatch within that.
Yeah.
Second question I've got is around the recharge plan. Now, if my memory serves me correctly, and very often it doesn't, but my understanding is that the recharge plan was costed at round about 3.2 billion ask of government. My understanding is that to date we have only received 2% of that. So really I want to know what your plans are to follow up on that. And then my final question, Andy, is around the community recovery document that was sent out to us. And I'm particularly focusing on the voluntary sector part of that document. So your ask of government is around a voluntary sector resilience fund. So firstly, I'd like to understand how and who the CA have consulted within that sector to really understand what the need is and the vulnerabilities of that sector. And is it about sustainability of the sector, or is it about delivering specific asks through the COVID crisis? When I raised this in our Health and Adult Social Care Scrutiny meeting yesterday in Dudley, our voluntary sector knew nothing about it. So I'd be quite interested to know who you've consulted with about it, what the actual assessed need is, and what that resilience fund is hopefully going to meet. Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, okay. So 3 different questions. So first of all, on the jobs numbers, I think perhaps the best way of describing this is the number of people who are claiming benefit. Now, that is not quite the same number as the question you've asked, and the reason that we don't have the exact number on the question you've asked is, surprisingly, we don't have that by regional basis. We have a national number there, we don't have a regional basis. We have all the employment rates, unemployment rates for the region, and they appear to be lagging what is happening in terms of redundancies. But the increase in claimants is about 97,000 since the period here. But in a sense, Kathy,
so that's doubled, is that, Andy?
It's nearly doubled, yes, nearly doubled, yeah. And this is in no way any consolation. Actually, the rate of increase here is less than the country, even though it's a huge leap. So that sort of tells you what's there. And the other point, Kathy, I'll go back to Lisa's observation, is there are a huge number of people still not on any of those registers because of the furlough scheme. So no one's debating the scale of what could come. Then in terms of your numbers around the 3.2 billion, I don't think your number is right. 2% I think would work out roughly 64 million. So to be precise, we have had about 170 million of specific new funding, which is 84 million for the Brownfield Fund, the Get Building Fund, which was 66, and then a number of skills elements that have been devolved to us. But it is very unrepresentative, that, because we've also had a large number of the things that we have asked for being agreed and paid for by central government. And therefore, they haven't devolved the cash to us, but they're doing exactly what we asked them to do. And 2 good examples of that, we asked for a devolved retrofitting fund that is now being held nationally but will be delivered locally. That's a £2 billion national fund. And then in the skills area, I've already said, whether it be apprenticeship support, retraining support, the Kickstart support, that again is all national cash delivered locally. And what we've done about this, and we're not in any way hiding all the numbers here, we have produced a sheet which I think you have all seen, and if you haven't, I don't mind circulating it, with all of that very transparently. So I think, Kathy, your description of the numbers is not a reflection of what's gone on, and I've tried to describe that number far more generally. And then the third piece, the resilience fund, I actually don't know exactly who has been consulted on this. I do know some of the consultees, so Birmingham Voluntary Services Council, for example. I do not know why it is not. They have not had a consultation with anyone from Dudley. We will have to follow that up. The critical point about this document, though, unlike the recharge document, this has not yet been signed off by the leaders and by the board. That will be happening over the next few weeks. So it is still absolutely up for influencing, Kathy, this is.
Can I just come back on that last point, if you don't mind, Chair?
Please.
Yeah, so I think absolutely, and that's welcome to know that it isn't signed off yet, so it is up for influence. I think the point that I need to understand really is this money to sustain the sector, because obviously many of the charitable and voluntary sectors have lost their ability to fundraise over this period. So is it about a fund to sustain them through till we reach some sort of normality, or is it a fund that is purely there to deliver COVID essential activity that local authorities are not able to do?
You're quite right. I didn't answer that part of it. And the answer to that question is the first. It is definitely the first. There have already been, as you know, separate fundings for, let's call them service provision. This is about trying to make sure the infrastructure of the voluntary and community sector, the voluntary sector is sustained.
Okay, I am going to bring colleagues in, but Kathy's question there lends me to one that I was going to put, and it's a little bit about the contrast of the government's approach, and then ultimately I do want to come back with, I really don't get why you have a community recovery and an economic recovery, because again, unless your economic recovery is benefiting your community, what's the point in it? Where I've got an example, and it troubles me greatly. Clearly, I think it would be a very brave person who is to suggest that the government's handling of the track and trace, test and trace, whatever it's called, and Serco's handling of that contract has been anything other than a debacle. And indeed, the failure to develop a effective track and trace has meant that some of the economic impacts that we are now witnessing arise from that failure. We did not need to be in this position. We can accept we are where we are, but we did not need to be there. We could have developed effective testing. What I'm finding really difficult at this point in time is Serco got some £108 million for the track and trace contract. Serco, as we know, have their fingers in many pies in public services, and in Birmingham, they run some 9 different swimming and leisure facilities. And during the very early stage of the pandemic, we were written to by the government, and the government told us that some of the pandemic legislation meant we were bound by contractual change, and that it actually impacted upon our relationship with contractors. The long and short of it is we are now obliged to subsidise Serco to a tune of 1.1 million to keep our leisure facilities open that we had supposedly transferred the risk then. So out of a hard-pressed local authority budget, I find the government has told us we are having to subsidise Serco 1.1 million already. And for example, the hundreds and fantastic community organisations and voluntary groups that came out and provide the food relief network across the region don't get a penny. You know, who's benefiting from this pandemic? It is abhorrent to me that we are being required to subsidise the organisation whose failure has created many of the problems we face. I just welcome your comments on that.
Okay, fine. Let me just comment on your other way, throw a line before you ask me that question, because I think it was an important point that we need all to understand. The community and the economic recovery are the two sides of the same coin. No one is questioning that. And the proof that everyone understands that, in the community recovery document that you have been sent, it says very clearly that jobs and training is part of that. So there is no artificial distinction. They are absolutely hand in glove. But it is also true that in the economic recovery document that we did not deal with some of the critical things around health that are, for example, in the community recovery document. So actually, I see this as very positive. I see this as acknowledgement by the CA that both sides of this come together for ultimate outcomes. So I think, if you don't mind, I just needed to respond to that because you implied that they weren't. So now then, Serco, it's really not for me to comment on the Birmingham City Council issue with Serco. Really, it isn't.
Maybe you'd like to comment on Serco's handling of the track and trace.
Yeah, I will do, because actually, it's always dangerous for a politician to say this, but I will say I was proven right over this. So on the 28th of May, which was when Track and Trace was launched, I was asked to do Newsnight about it. And I said very clearly that the way this will succeed is actually fully engaging the local capability. and that has not been done. So I fully accept that the effort to do this centrally at the beginning was not the best way it could be done. Frankly, whoever was the contractor. And I do think all credit is due to our local authorities who have then locally complemented the national scheme. And Madam Chair, I have been consistent in being clear that that would have been a better approach to this.
Okay, so I will open to colleagues. I know you don't comment on the inequity of the private sector government advice telling us we have to subsidise Serco, where out of our very hard-pressed coffers against the voluntary sector. What I would also, I think, I suppose, have to conclude from that one, you told us so far that you strongly stated that the only way to test was if local capacity was fully engaged. You've also said that government didn't listen to your calls in terms of the investment that we were looking for and the requirement. We got a mere 170 million out of 3.2 billion. Clearly, government's not, our benefit of having a Tory mayor who has the year of government's not really paying off at the moment, is it?
Lisa, you again have put words completely into my mouth. I did not say that government had not listened. You said that. I said we have all. I gave you a specific example where we'd not persuaded them, and that was over the support for freelancers within the self-employed. I actually gave you examples of where the cash had come through in line with our recharge document. And I would also refer you to when we did the press conference on the launch of that and on 15th of June, that was, to say very clearly that nobody expected all the cash to come immediately. A lot of them, quite rightly, are long-term plans that will secure the future economic future of this region going forward. Only the most naive would possibly think that all that cash would have come by now. So I think you have genuinely put words into my mouth there.
Well, we can agree to disagree. Okay, I'm going to call Mike Chalk, who's been patiently waiting, and then can I go for Ahmed and Stephen in that order, and then Jackie, I'll pick you up.
Thank you, Chair. Mine's a very mundane question, actually. I'm sorry, I better introduce myself. Councillor Mike Chalk, Reddish Borough Council, representing North Worcestershire, the Shire counties. Very simple question. As a backbench councillor at Reddish Borough Council, I don't get all the details. And there's those two documents, the check my notes, the recovery document and the community recovery document. How do I, as a councillor or as a member of the public, how do I get hold of those? Are they online, or do I need to apply to have them sent to me, or how do I get hold of them?
Okay, you have been sent them, Mike. Tanya, can we ensure that Mike gets sent them again?
Sorry, Chair. Are they online? Should I have seen them online?
Well, the recharge document's actually a public document, so that's certainly online. The community recovery one, as it's work in progress, is not yet online, but you were definitely sent it in preparation for this meeting.
That's one of the reasons why I haven't got it yet. Thank you very much.
Okay. Ahmed.
Thank you very much, Chair. And may I begin by thanking the Mayor for the support that he's given to leaders of Sandwell, Birmingham, Solihull, Walsall and Wolverhampton, the areas that are currently in Tier 2, especially in light of the challenges that Tier 2 presents for the hospitality sector. The Mayor mentioned the job support scheme. Would he agree, compared to furlough, and bearing in mind that no one is required to pay 66% of their rent, their mortgages and their overheads, is it the case that actually the government should be providing an extension to the furlough scheme, especially in our Tier 2 areas? And I'm really worried for a lot of our hospitality sector in Sandwell, because in actual fact, even if the job support scheme came to these areas, the government would only be giving a mere 33% of wages. 66% would have to be forked out by the employers themselves. So what really are the government doing to actually provide us with adequate support, because it seems to me, and I agree with the Mayor, that at the beginning of the crisis in March, there was substantial support available, which was significant for a lot of people. But it seems like the government's now ripping that up at the behest of a lot of our small businesses here in Sandwell that will frankly struggle to recover from the crisis. So should there be an extension of furlough, in his opinion, in these tier 2 areas? And what more financial support are the government going to provide? And if they're not listening to him, who are they actually going to listen to? Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Ahmed. And thank you for acknowledging the teamwork that's gone into supporting all the local authorities, because I do think that's been a good feature of the last 6 months, actually. To answer your question straight up, the answer is yes. And that's why I took to the BBC and ITV on Monday night to say so. Let's just be really clear why we say that. The job support scheme is appropriate. Let's give an example. If you are a manufacturer where you are back to work, but you may be doing 80% of the throughput that you had before, for employers then to get, as you've worked the maths out and described them, that sort of support is appropriate, and they can plan their workforce around that. So this is not me saying that that scheme is inappropriate, full stop. For lots of sectors, it is right. But the specific point about the hospitality sector in tier 2 is that clearly, even though they are allowed to open, because of the restrictions, their patronage is likely to be a fraction of what it was before. And you can't cover those costs on the current job support scheme. So exactly why, and again, we made this public yesterday, Mike, that I wrote to Rishi Sunak yesterday, 2 days ago now, stating that we need to amend the support scheme for the sectors that cannot trade in the tier 2 areas. I hope that's entirely clear, Ahmed.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And again, clearly picking up on the creative cultural sectors. In my ward alone, we have a number of people from CBSO, the Royal Ballet, technicians, festival organisers, all who will not qualify for anything and who are really fearful of keeping their roofs above their heads. I'm now handing to Steve Simpkins and then Jackie.
Thank you, Chair. Can I ask you, Andy, do you fund any of the Kickstart projects, and would you fund if you could? Because you was a big advocate of the Kickstart projects.
Yeah.
So do you fund the Kickstart projects?
No, it's a brilliant question, Steve, because it actually draws out what I was trying to say. In our document, we asked for funding to do effectively what the Kickstart scheme has become. But the way the government has chosen to do it is to fund it all nationally. So the straight answer to your question is no, the WMCA does not process the funding. What the WMCA is all paid for by central government. It's a national scheme. Yeah. And there's no cap on it, by the way. So the more West Midlands businesses that participate in it, the more money we get from government. What we have to do, there's a role for us, a very important role. Because if you are an employer who are offering less than 30 places, you have to consolidate your 5 with another company's 5 to get to 30 for the funding. And we are playing that role as the consolidator. But straight answer, no, we do not actually process the cash. That is being done nationally. But also straight answer your question, if it was devolved locally, I would do something like Kickstart, yes.
Well, if I'll come back on that, Chair, surely you're our voice at Westminster. Shouldn't you be saying to the government, we want to fund this directly in cooperation with what's already on the ground to add value? Surely that's the role of the combined authority, to add that value to that. The other question I'd like to ask you, Andy, is we've got a robust redundancy team that works with HMRC. Surely some of the CA resource could go in there and bolster that, not just in Wolverhampton, but all across the region. Surely that's your key leadership role, as to deliver these sort of services in a time of crisis.
Okay. I think we are doing on the first one, on the Kickstart, exactly what you're talking about. I don't need to have the money, but we are playing a role to make sure that there are more of these opportunities there. Spot on. But honestly, it's a brilliant example of the government controlling the cash, and I'm happy with that, frankly. We've got a role to make sure it's maximised. And we've also got a role, by the way, to make sure that businesses know what's on offer to them and to keep and to promote that facility. Now, on the redundancy, I'm glad you've raised that, because the answer is yes, you are right. And that is exactly what is going on. So we are working, your authority is probably the best in the region, actually, but we have a team under our skills team who do actually work on the addressing the redundancy piece. And also, you'll be pleased to know, we also do some of the rapid recruitment as well. So when the Nightingale Hospital was looking for people quickly, we took a role there. We're working with West Midlands Police, where they're looking for rapid recruitment. So both the downside and indeed the good side, we actively lead that.
Steve, I suppose I'm still, you know, I still don't understand why the refusal to have a jobs task force. And as you and I know that I think definitely on things like the apprenticeship levy, the combined authorities played a really important role in terms of the accumulation role, but most of our businesses do not have 30 plus. So we have a Kickstart scheme that's not fit for our region. And as our mayor, we need you to be telling government what our businesses are. And for the Black Country, particularly, you know, with COVID, climate and technology on its way, it's those small businesses that absolutely need to be picked up on. And it doesn't seem to be coming together. Right. Jackie, can I ask you, you can come back when Jackie comes in, my love, and lovely to see you again.
Oh, it's good to be back. Thank you, Chair. Andy, I actually want to unpack the issue with regards to Serco, so I'm going to go back to that if you don't mind. If you haven't got the answer to these questions, I'll be asking you to get the answer from government, please. But my answer is around the procurement process. And basically, why Serco would have been chosen above other companies. What did they have that other companies didn't have? Thank you.
And Jackie, I always try to answer as honestly and fully as I can to all these questions. I cannot know the answer to that. That was a central government procurement process. It honestly is not something I will have the information upon. I will willingly do what I can to try to find out the answer to that in terms of what's in the public domain. But I think we do have to be realistic about what I can be held accountable for, and it is not that, I'm afraid. Just can I come back to what was said about earlier, though, again, the intro, I'll try to be brief, because again, I don't think you've heard what I've said. Kickstart has got two elements to it. There's the over 30 job vacancies, and the company that's used this more than any other company is Tesco. Makes sense. Frankly, they can negotiate with central government without any local provision. They're structured that way nationally. If it is less than a 30 company, like the SMEs in the Black Country, to quote what you said, we absolutely have a job. So if there's two with one company, three with another company, that's what I'm saying. We are adding them together to make sure they can go forward. And we are also busy with the LEPs, the chambers, the growth hubs, telling businesses in the Black Country or never anywhere else that is what is available. So we are doing exactly what you're asking for.
So just for specifics, how many companies have we packaged up?
I don't know how many companies. What I do know is that there's 3,000 work placements already funded across the West Midlands. I don't know how many companies that's across.
That could be with Tesco's. That could be with the big.
It's a mix. It's a mix, so actually.
It comes back to the corporates continue to survive this. The absolute backbone of our economy, our family businesses, our SMEs, our creative sectors don't. And it's what is the response for them? Can I bring in Councillor Lucy Seymour-Smith, and can I then bring in Angus Lee?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So, Andy, on a slightly different issue. So, unemployment is clearly rising. It's going to continue. Not just for lack of jobs or employers shedding staff because of local lockdowns, but there are other factors as well. So obviously parents are already struggling to combine working and childcare when their child's school is closed.
But currently over 70% of women who are planning to return from maternity leave can't do so at the moment, or are struggling to do so because they're unable to find the childcare that will enable them to do so. And if you think about the fact that women make up over half of 0 hours contract, which is unstable work at any point, and clearly the situation is very worrying, and we don't want to rebuild an economy without moms and women in it. So first of all, is this on the combined authorities' radar, and if so, what specifically is being done to address this? Second of all, very quick question, your recharge document referred to resetting the economy. This can only be done with good employment and actually acknowledging the scale and the actual scale of unemployment. So in terms of 0 hours contracts, what work is being done around monitoring those on 0 hours contracts who wouldn't necessarily be classified as unemployed but do not have any work? And then finally, the Union Learning Fund has been axed, which I fully appreciate is a national decision. But given the regional situation and that every pound invested does see an economic return of over £12, I would like to hear your thoughts on the gamble of taking away a tried and tested method of upskilling an economic return in the current climate. Thanks, Chair.
Yeah, thank you, Lucy. Lots of questions in there. So let's deal with the last one first, because actually it's very straightforward. So I'm aware of what's happened, or what's being proposed, sorry, and Lee Barron, the TUC lead for the region, has been in touch, and I am absolutely clear. It is a good scheme, and I would wish to support it. And if there is an opportunity for me to add my voice to that, I'm very happy so to do. And that's been a clear position I've had supporting that scheme for as many years as I've been doing this job. So that's straightforward. The second point that you draw out, sorry, the first thing you said, though, Lucy, is very important to the CA. So this whole point about will the pandemic have disproportionate effects on women, those who are less well off, those in BAME communities, and sometimes intersection of all three, is absolutely clear to us. And it's why we have tried to concentrate some of our responses to deal with that. And I'll just give you one statistic which demonstrates this, the awareness to this. But I said earlier on, our single biggest revenue budget was adult education. And we are spending 73% of our adult education with BAME communities, to try to acknowledge the issue that we have to lift levels there. We're also, if you look, we're also doing specific activities for retraining women, because they definitely have less access to some areas, and an obvious area would be digital skills. So we've got particular programs to encourage women into digital and also into construction. So some of the areas where we're putting money on the table, we are definitely tilting it in favour of those communities who are likely to be more harshly affected by the pandemic. So it can't be a full answer, Lucy, but to your question, are we aware of it? Are we taking choices around it? The answer is categorically yes.
To be firm, Mr. Mayor, that the adult education budget and the contracting profile of it being a BAME community is an as-is situation. That was the legacy that you inherited from past AE budgets, and that in part reflects an ongoing failure of actually uplifting the skills, training and employment opportunities of many of our BAME communities in our region. So what we would need to be seeing is actually, what I'm interested in is how many members of the BAME community are actually on a pathway now that will take you through to higher level training.
Okay.
And actually, what are we doing in terms of the failure? So one example I got, and clearly I've, if I had a cat, I'd have kicked it many times during this pandemic. But I find it very difficult when you launched the 5G program in the middle of lockdown, actually I'd got school kids in my area whose parents have got no Wi-Fi, have got no laptops, and could not do their studying. And then lo and behold, they find themselves in the GCSE debacle, the A-level debacle, and some of the few lucky ones who managed to get into university are now locked up in halls of residence. It's that massive distance, the digital divide, is not so much a gender specific thing in our region. It actually all roots back to poverty. We are a hugely deprived region, and the programs that are in place aren't uplifting those communities. And what we have been asking for the last 2 years of you is, what specific targeted programs, what have you changed, what have you bent to actually close that gap?
Okay, so you've made lots of points there, but let's start with the substantive one. So the AEB budget, where I'm giving you the numbers, we have had responsibility for actually spending the money for 1 year. And that is the proportion of the money spent in different ways in that period. So that is what I am responsible for ultimately, and the CA board for signing that off. So that is not what we've inherited from when it was run centrally. That is what the WMCA has done. And I think there is clear evidence of a tilt there. And in terms of what we're also trying to do, because what you say is right about low-level skills that don't give people an opportunity to lift themselves out of poverty and get a good job. We've also tried to make sure it is bent very firmly in favour of getting skills that will enable people to secure good work. So that concentration on skills at level 3 within the AEB is very, very deliberate. And again, I'm more than happy that you crawl all over those numbers, because I actually think the WMCA and the team have done a good job on that.
So can I bring in Councillor Angus Lee, then Peter Fowler, and then I will finish this sort of overview on the economy and recovery with a councillor with a question from Councillor Steve Simpkins. So Angus.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, Mr. Mayor.
Good morning.
Councillor Lee's from Dudley Council, Cabinet Member for the West Midlands Defined Authority. Now, my question, there's been a lot of questions this morning directed at what's happening around the economics of things. And my question is really exploring the preventative measures and efforts to protect that economy. And I'm going to ask a question and then a small example and then a very short question, if I may. And I do that in the background where there's a meeting in Dudley this morning. We've already discussed councils at level 2 and some up north going to level 3, which has major implications both to families and to the economy. And we are in Dudley, I believe, we're on the verge of going to level 2. We're about 1.2% away. So that will have a major impact on us as well. But it appears that while infections are rising, deaths are trending upwards, how can we get people, both businesses and the public, to follow the requirements to socially distance, as clearly many are not and do not appear to take the COVID threat seriously? As the alternative could be a second lockdown, which would be devastating for all of our local communities and businesses, undoubtedly. So that's the sort of question. I'll give you an example where this is happening. I had an appointment at the Corbett Hospital 2 weeks ago. I was sent off around the passageway to Area 3. When I got there, there was about 12 people standing outside the Area 3 waiting room. And there was about 10 people I counted inside. None were social distancing. There was a gentleman in front of me on crutches with no chairs for him to sit down on. So I after a couple of minutes, I felt uncomfortable, not only for those people, but for myself. So I left. I went back to reception, told them to put on my notes of what I'd seen, and I was totally disgruntled with the fact there was no social distancing. Subsequently, I have made a formal complaint to Diane Wake, who's the Chief Executive of Russell's Hall Hospital, our Director of Adult Health and our Director of Health and Wellbeing. And I have had a response. But that's an example of where clearly it's not only how much money can the government direct towards the economy and apprenticeships. It's we need, lockdown worked, but we don't want to go back there. And my second part to that question is how closely, you made the point before, how closely are you liaising with central government regarding these enforcements and measurements around preventative measures And you previously mentioned that the government had been heavy-handing in doing it centrally, but it's always been the local authorities who've delivered it. Thank you.
Okay, so really good questions, Angus. So I think the answer to the first thing is it goes back to what Ahmed said in some ways. I feel that we have done a relatively good job here at giving a clear, simple, united message to citizens about what the rules are. Because the only way that we're going to beat this is every citizen following the rules. And so when the additional restrictions came in Birmingham, Solihull and Sandwell, as it was at the beginning, with just 3 on the 14th of September, there was utter unity between government, between local authority leaders, the health professional leaders, the police on that. And actually the way we've tried to do that is a weekly press conference, which the regional media all attend and they all tell the stories. And often, if you take something like Midlands Today, they run the coverage of it every Friday night. So that unity is very important. And if I may make an observation, that is in sharp contrast to what we now see this week in different parts of the country, where it must be very difficult for citizens to know what they should do. And we've tried to achieve that by working closely with government. Hasn't always worked. I've acknowledged in this call, we've been some things we've disagreed on, but in that case, working closely with Matt Hancock was effective. And he actually said in the Parliament last week that the West Midlands was the example of how that works. And it's not about the politics it's about the citizens have a clear message about what the rules are and what is expected. So that is how we've tried to answer your question. The second, what was your second point again, Angus, very quickly?
I think it was just about people not being responsible.
Yeah,
Angus?
Part of the first question was about people not taking the threat seriously.
Yeah. Well,
and it's happening in the down the chain, down the age chain. But you've covered a bit with the government. So it's how, what can we do more to get a greater impact to those people to stop gathering and hugging each other and everything else.
Absolutely. This is the unfathomable question, isn't it? Unfathomable question, because everyone can see the danger, but some people choose to ignore it, particularly in the, very honest, the data is saying that's particularly in the under 21s. So you just keep ramming home the message about this whole sort of piece about it might not kill you, but it might well kill a family member. And that's what we will continue to do.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, Chair.
So, can we, I do apologise, I need to invite in Councillor Bob Grinsell, who's indicated much earlier that he wished to make a point. And then can I bring in Councillor Peter Fowler, and then can we briefly, Councillor Stephen Simpkins. I do need to move on because we spent over an hour on this section. So briefly, Bob, Peter, then Stephen.
Thank you, Lisa. Hi, Andy.
Hi.
We've heard an awful lot of doom and gloom, and things are particularly difficult out there. I want to try and switch it, I hope, to a more positive aspect, because here in Solihull, Meriden and the borders or the northern part of Coventry, I think we can already see that the investment in both HS2 and UK Central is certainly going to be beneficial. But I'd like your thoughts on how you feel that investment on those two projects will help the whole of the combined authority.
Yeah, okay, great question, Bob, because I don't want in any way to deny the current challenges, just as your question honours. But equally, we have got to think about what the really big economic transformational opportunities are for the next 5 years. And there is no question that HS2 is going to be the biggest producer of jobs in the region. So people have their views about whether it's the right thing, but it's coming. So we've got to make sure the jobs are produced here. So again, what have I actually done about it? Very topical, because just this Wednesday we held a summit for SMEs who would supply HS2. So the main contractors, people like Balfour Beatty, Vinci, Lango O'Rourke, that were there talking about how they would then have subcontracts with all these small companies. And I don't actually know how many came on the line. I know that 818 companies registered for it, West Midlands companies. And that is a huge opportunity. So it's a brilliant example of what I tried to say at the beginning. Whilst all the horrors are going on, we've got to keep focusing on the big opportunities going forward. And we've tried to do something very, very practical just this week about that.
Thanks for that, Andy. Peter Fowler.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you, Andy. First of all, declaring an interest just in case. I am a member of Equity, the Actors and Entertainers Union, and the reason why I'm saying that, I'd like to thank Andy because arranged a meeting with Equity management to discuss the problems that we're having in the West Midlands on the arts and the theatres, etc. And thank you, Andy, for your assistance in that to government as well. I think, Lisa, there's been some good questions that I've heard this afternoon, and with Angus, a certain comment about people not taking COVID seriously. Yes, I think that has potential for affecting even more jobs. It's the effect it's having on families too, with potential lockdowns. And certainly I found, I think, as Andy's mentioned, with public transport, people are still not taking that seriously, going onto public transport, not wearing masks, etc. It's a tough one, but it's just reinforcing the message. The one interesting thing that I'm asking is about the actual document that we saw with the recovery coordinating group. And I'm hoping that a number of the comments and questions that have been made from the ONS committee will be taken forward to that group, and hope and expectations, because I was looking at the summary of the 30 community recovery issues that's in the document and the opportunities for further collaboration. And I'm referring that because it was talking, as Lisa was talking about, was about the high streets, the city centre task force, and the future of city works, and it's talking about helping the BAME sector as well. And then your summary, important one as well, the summary of asks for the government. So I'm assuming that when you meet at the end of this month or in a couple of weeks' time, you'll be looking at the priorities for development, as it says in the boxes about questions for feedback. I think that's a very helpful document, and the reason why I'm highlighting that, Andy, because I think a lot of what's been asked of you today is actually in the summary of 30 community recovery issues. Thank you.
Yeah. So I think that's maybe the most straightforward question, Peter, because the answer is yes. That's exactly how we see it. And I think it illustrates a really important point. It's the interplay between those different issues, which is the really tricky thing to get hold of. And I'm not saying that's solely my responsibility. It's what all leaders are grappling with. And yes, you're absolutely right. Some of the issues in here have already gone into the CSR ask the government. So two really good examples around the health pieces, both the preventative health ask and the whole piece about the diagnostics hub as well. So yes, we're trying to get those sort of chunked up as to the way in which government takes decisions, but actually they're part of a much bigger tapestry that all links together.
Okay. I really hope you haven't opened a whole can of worms there on the diagnostic hub, because Scrutiny is certainly questioning the location of a diagnostic hubs in Grand Central, especially now there's even less reason with John Lewis closing for many of us to go.
We're not going to discuss that.
Councillor Steve Simpkins, and then what I would like to do is to move on to the next section briefly. Steve.
The current jobless figures for Wolverhampton are 10% of its population. Sandwell's at 9.5, Walsall's at 8.6. There is, to retrain, you need at least a 6 to 8 week training course. There is going to be a shortfall of income because it takes roughly exactly the same time to wade through the universal credit process. So for 6 to 8 weeks, people and families will have no income. How will they survive? The other side of this coin is you have a budget of over 90 million for skills, and we have to bid for that. Why don't we just passport that money straight to the authorities to get these people trained as quickly and back into the economy? The other question is there's lots of funding that's coming that will be ceasing. We've got the European funding that will cease for local business support and activity. So therefore, we know that it's been announced in the budgets and the statements from the Chancellor. How do we get that money? And again, why do we have to bid? Surely in a crisis like this, we need to make sure that we're supporting the growth hubs. Surely bidding is going to protract that process even longer. So you know what we need to do. When we've got an example of Wolves at Work, we work with the CA and they passport the money on. We don't want to go through a bidding round. Surely that money should come straight through.
Okay. So great question, Steve. I'll come to him just 1 second. Do you mind? Your colleague from Wolverhampton has asked a question in the chat that I've not picked up yet. So just let me answer that with a one-word answer, Phil. The answer is I have personally not spoken to the Federation of Public Transport, but Passenger Transport, but Laura Schoaf, Managing Director of Transport for the West Midlands, has spoken at length with them about this. So we are engaged with them, yes. So that hopefully deals with that. Now, Steve, your 3 questions. You're absolutely right about the last bit, and this is actually a very serious point, the whole point about there is European funding that is supporting a lot of activity across the West Midlands, and it will dry up this April. And we've known about this for a long time, obviously since Brexit, frankly, and we have not yet got clarity from the government as to what is going to replace it. So it's called the Shared Prosperity Fund. How it's going to be allocated in terms of how much for each region, what the priorities are, it's a very live debate. And actually, I think our MPs need to be cross-party lobbying on this because this really matters to the West Midlands. It's about £500 million over 3 years. So, Steve, thank you for raising it. It's a very substantial issue for us. There has been a little extra support for growth hubs, for example, given straight from government, and that's been a good thing because they're playing a critical role. The second point that you asked about was all about our own skills budget. So we do work directly with local authorities, and the Wolves at Work example is a good one where we have passed some cash over, but we do have to have a process by which there is a sort of, let's call it, it's almost like, if I'm honest, it is like our own challenge for different parts of the authority to want different cash. There's competition between colleges, between LAs, between independent training providers. We can't do without that. But where there is a great local authority scheme, we absolutely work with them, and yours is a good one. Similarly, that's the approach to the youth hub as well. We bring everyone together. And then you're gone.
Go on, finish, and then
the last bit very quickly is obviously about those people who have to go on to universal credit. 2 things we've done in our document. We've asked for an increase to sustain the increase in the universal credit rate that was put up at the beginning of COVID, and we've asked for it to be sustained. And in terms of the speed at which it's settled, I actually think DWP, there'll be counterexamples to this, but they've committed to act on everything as swiftly as they can. And you can, of course, have an emergency payment if your full payment doesn't come through quickly.
But sorry, Chair, if I
Steve,
could
we quick, very, very quickly, and then we need to move on.
It's important that we get the money and stop having to go through these rounds of bidding. You can always check the expenditure after and whether it's been good for delivery. You know, it's office a time of both DWP and our officers in local authorities is going to be wasted by submitting bids to projects that already work. Surely we should recognise good practice and deliver that straight away. The problem that I've got with the all right, the government's increased universal credit, great, but it's increased. We're going to be faced with 40,000 people in Wolverhampton who are going to be coming off furlough. That's a potential 40,000 extra to the jobless figures. The DWP are going to be swamped, and to retrain it's 8 weeks. Yeah. So therefore, we need to make sure that our authorities can move swiftly to fill that void. When you're faced with 40,000 people who could be unemployed, wanted to change their lives. So this is where you could really lend a hand, stop the bureaucracy with the bidding rounds, Surely now, after 4 years, you understand what needs to be delivered in each of the local authorities and the neighbouring authorities, and then we can move on as quickly as possible. This is terrible for people's lives.
Can I just come into that, because it's probably my concluding point for this section, then maybe Andy, you can come back with your concluding point. Where I'm having real difficulty with this session, and where I've had with many of the responses, is we have a crisis. We have a cliff edge in 2 weeks' time. We have thousands of people in our region who are going to lose their jobs. And what we need to be looking at is, how do you retrain people? How do you retain those jobs? And how do you repurpose those companies? What we have done in the past, in 2007 and 8, when it came to Longbridge, we set up the task forces, we've gone in, we've rolled up our sleeves, and we've made things happen on the ground. Nobody can feed their kids with a community recovery document. You need a wage, and people will not be having a wage. And you argue, you suggest that the MPs need to be lobbying for changes to the Shared Prosperity Fund. I think we've all been arguing that the Shared Prosperity Fund, which has been promised for over a year, should come through. And one of what our MPs are actually referring to, and Liam in particular is referred to, is the pandemic of poverty that is afflicting our region. And what we absolutely need is responses from our combined authority and from our mayor that challenges government and offers a future for those people. And one youth hub, given we are one of the youngest regions, is not going to answer that. And I've asked this question several times. Why aren't we having a jobs task force? Why haven't we got a task force?
Right.
If we've got the corporate boys sitting there on the economic forum, and we haven't actually got people working alongside the companies. That is just like my final question, and then we can move on. But you come back, please.
So, you keep talking about what happened with Longbridge in 2005, and I've got no reason to question that story, but it was focused on one sector in one place. This is a pandemic across the whole region in all sorts of ways. It's not the same. Now, we might not have called it a jobs task force, but what we've been describing for the last hour and 20 minutes is the approach to try to protect and grow the economy that will secure jobs. If you want to call it the jobs response, fair enough. So I've said many times, what's the most important thing in this document? It is about jobs. And we've headlined it with how many jobs it will protect and create going forward. And with respect, we've talked about lots of individual actions that lead to things happening on the ground. And so it is there, but it's not badged in exactly the way you would wish to describe. And ultimately, I've laid out our approach. You have every right to say you're wrong, but I have tried to describe our overall approach to it.
I respect that, Mr. Mayor. I think from the perspective of community, from the perspective of the communities and the response that Scrutiny has pursued for the last 18 months is for whose benefit and where is the evidence that it's making a difference on the ground. And again, the inequalities in our region, the poverty in our region just seem to be showing it's not hitting for the benefit of communities. I want to briefly move on because it's an area that I know a number of colleagues have spoken to me about, and one that we, particularly hope we can secure your support and influence. Clearly, one of the areas where we've got many priorities, but we've talked about the need to address climate change, and indeed in your own target, you're very clear that certain things will only happen, 2041 will only happen if the government provides you with some money and whether you have more powers and various other things. And again, much as I'm very happy to challenge the leadership of Birmingham on their adequacy of their climate plans, it is a fair comment that without the government and without the region providing that framework, Birmingham as the lead sort of economic core and bearer of the carbon budget cannot address that. So one of the areas of concern, and I'm going to ask Kathy to reflect on this initially, is around the government's proposals around the national planning regulations and the changes. Everyone wants to see regulation not as the first post, but the second post. But if we are to build towards a zero economy, if we're to actually take us from being the lowest rate for affordable housing in the UK, then actually planning powers are quite important. Kathy, can you just outline to the Mayor the concerns that you were putting forward the other day?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I think, Mr. Mayor, what I'm looking for is support in terms of lobbying government, particularly around the permitted residential development. Now, permitted residential developments, I believe, have a serious risk of ghettoising our town centres. I understand that it's a quick, easy fix in terms of volume of accommodation, particularly meeting a need where authorities have a lack of single-person accommodation. I understand that. What we are doing, though, is developing office blocks into, I think it's recently been described by somebody in the press from one of the London boroughs as creating open prisons. The quality of the accommodation is generally very poor. Because they are cheap rents, then they may not be asking for rent guarantees, which then means, and I absolutely understand that people need somewhere to live, but people need to live somewhere that is safe, somewhere that is conducive to them being able to partake in the local economy. The permitted residential developments mean that nothing has to be taken into account in terms of the local surroundings. So we have families who live in these blocks where there are no outside play areas for children. There is nothing taken into account in terms of GP registration and GP needs, health needs, education needs, and road infrastructure. So really what I'm looking for is that you will support the West Midlands region by lobbying Parliament to actually bring in some kind of enforcement and legislation that mean that potential developers of these residential office blocks actually have to comply with taking all of the other issues into account, so we create positive, good quality living accommodation for people.
Okay, very clear. Let me answer the general point that Lisa made, and then we'll come specifically to your very precise question, Kathy. So, someone got feedback? Yeah, just needs to. Whoever's got feedback just needs to go on mute a second. Yeah. Okay. So the general point here is that this area of housing and development is definitely one that we can see real progress, and the CA has put its money where its mouth is in terms of affordable housing percentages. So last year, 16,900 homes built across the West Midlands, and that is a 40% increase over 2 years. And the affordable percentage was 23%. Now, no one is saying that's good enough. No one is saying it is something where we say job done, stop, but it is above the percentages that nearly any local authority delivers. And it is partly because we have insisted, and this is the point about money where mouth is, that we will not use any combined authority funding on any development unless there is 20% affordable. And we have also redefined affordable to be relative to people's incomes, not the value of property in the market. And I think we are the first area of the country to do that. And I can find you a number of examples where insisting on that actually change the proposals from developers to lift the affordable percentage. So we are making good progress on that, and we'll continue to use the new cash we've just achieved to do that further. So there's absolutely no question to the chair's question about where can you demonstrate success. There is clear demonstrable success. Now, to your question, Kathy, you are absolutely right. there is an opportunity to influence this through the planning reforms proposals. And the CA will not be putting in a response to the consultation on that. Individual local authorities are, as they're the planning authorities. I will be putting in my own view, and I am happy to say in front of you all, I will be arguing, as you have, that the permitted development rights as described is not delivering the quality issues that you are quite rightly identifying, because the quality as well as the number of homes is absolutely critical, and it's why we've, for example, done our whole piece about the design charter earlier this year. Sorry, Lisa, you're just on mute, I think.
My second mute of the day. We've regrettably run out of time. I think we've got for members of Scrutiny, we have a housing scrutiny meet specific focus coming up in November. And I think we will want to deep dive a little more into those figures and the actual number of units that are going to come out. I thank you, Mr. Mayor, for attending today and sharing with us your views. I don't know if you've got any final sort of comments before we sort of close down the webcast. And what I'm asking committee to do is if we can just have half an hour to just consider what we want to feed back to the broader board. Is there anything you would like to say, Mr. Mayor, in conclusion?
Peter's put a question in the chat, so just very quickly on that. The recovery, the community recovery piece, I think goes to our next board, which is the 13th of November. So not long to wait for that, but there's just the process to go through there. OK, I don't think there is, to be very honest, Chair. We've had a really good run round it all. All I would reflect is that, of course, there are political differences about this, but I do honestly believe, and Ahmed's question drew this out, there is a really important role about political unity and leadership in getting the messages across to citizens at this very, very testing time for us all. And that's one thing I have tried to do.
And again, I would say that I think local authority leaders would respect the fact that you've recognised the absolute importance of local government in this and the important leadership role that local authorities take, and that has been welcomed. I think what is a difference, and again, what I suppose as scrutiny we may well come to ask you is, absolutely we need to grow an economy, but if we cannot grow an economy that benefits